In a year defined by Red Bull's near absolute dominance, their seemingly flawless season had only one hiccup in Singapore. The synergy between the perfect car and the perfect driver has left us all wondering, what is the secret sauce behind their triumph? Brace yourselves, because Red Bull possesses a game-changing trick that's propelled them to annihilate the competition this season. As we look ahead to 2024, how did Red Bull make a car that can obliterate the grid at every race? And what are the coveted key ingredients every team is itching to steal from Red Bull's unparalleled success? Let's find out. Red Bull's performance this season has broken every record I can think of in Formula 1. The only thing missing from their record book is winning every race in a single season, which has never happened in Formula 1. This is one of the most impressive team performances in a single season ever. Some might say the most impressive. Why don't you tell me in the comments where you would rate it? Red Bull's success is down to a whole host of reasons. The obvious one is Max Verstappen, whose consistent brilliance this season has been unlike anything the sport has ever seen. He is the first driver to break the Alberto Ascari record for highest win percentage in a season of 75%. That record has stood since 1952. There are other personnel who have contributed though. Hannah Schmitz was already an incredibly highly rated strategist in Formula 1. Red Bull has been basically devoid of race strategy mistakes this season, while those around them have fumbled time and time again. Everyone knows about Adrian Newey and his aerodynamic prowess. His unparalleled grasp of aerodynamics in Formula 1 has been a huge advantage for Red Bull throughout their existence. Then there is the car he and the technical team at Red Bull have created. Its aerodynamic efficiency is unrivaled on the grid. The way it accelerates past any challengers with its DRS open is frankly shocking. Lewis Hamilton said it was the fastest car he had ever seen in Formula 1. The lack of drag it produces is amazing, but going fast in a straight line isn't enough to win Formula 1 races in the manner Red Bull have. Just ask Williams, who at many tracks have matched Red Bull in a drag race. You have to be fast through the corners as well, and there is another feature of the RB19 that every team on the grid will be looking to copy next season. A large part of what makes Red Bull so fast through the corners is their suspension setup. I'll explain why that is in a minute, but let's talk about what it is about the Red Bull suspension that makes it so good. Contrary to a large portion of the field, Red Bull opted for a pull rod front suspension layout for the new generation of cars, while at the rear it returned to a push rod layout for the first time since 2008. Red Bull was actually the driving factor behind a wholesale shift by the grid to pull rod from 2009 until the end of the previous era of regulations. Pull rod and push rod suspension might sound like a load of technical jargon, but it's relatively simple actually. In a pull rod configuration, the suspension arm is mounted at a diagonal angle from a low point on the chassis up to a higher point on the wheel assembly. When a tyre goes over a bump, the wheel pulls the torsion spring via the pull rod, pulling the suspension arm up and outwards from the chassis. In a push rod configuration, it's mounted the opposite way, so again at a diagonal angle, but higher on the chassis and lower on the wheel assembly. When the tyre goes over a bump, the wheel pushes the torsion spring via the push rod, pushing the rod upwards and towards the chassis. So in the pull rod front suspension setup, the springs are mounted lower on the nose and the wheel pulls the suspension rod out. Push rod is the opposite. This isn't as simple as Red Bull are doing it this way, so it must be better. Your chosen suspension setup will have a knock-on effect on the whole aerodynamic package, as well as how the nose, engine, drivetrain and gearbox are packaged. Changing your suspension configuration from pull to push rod or vice versa requires you to completely rebuild your car. Now, when Red Bull were first building the RB18 for 2022, the first year of the ground effect era, Adrian Newey actually devoted the majority of his time to the suspension setup of the car, not the larger aerodynamic parts such as the floor or the side pods. There was a very good reason for that. With these ground effect cars producing a very high percentage of their downforce from the underfloor, it's critical that the car is not moving around needlessly. For an F1 driver to be confident in a car, and therefore fast, the car has to behave consistently. Think about Mercedes. Both drivers have constantly complained that the car turns and brakes differently every lap, and because of that, they have no confidence in the car. Does Verstappen look like a driver without confidence in his car? Absolutely not. The ground effect floors produce downforce using the Venturi effect. I'm not going to deep dive into how this works. You can look up a video or article from someone with a doctorate in fluid dynamics who will explain it better. The layman's summary for Formula 1 is that by constricting the space that air has to pass through under the car, you decrease the pressure under the car, which then pulls the car down as it tries to equalize the pressure in that area. If the gap under your car to the track is constantly changing, the amount of downforce created by the Venturi effect is also constantly changing. If you don't know how much downforce your car is producing, then you don't know how it's going to respond to you touching the brake pedal or turning the steering wheel. Obviously, F1 cars don't have a constant readout of how much downforce is being produced. Drivers have to feel this by driving the car and understanding how it will respond in every situation. But if the amount of downforce being produced is constantly changing from lap to lap, then you can't be sure how the car will respond, and that is a huge issue. So, why did Adrian Newey decide to focus on the suspension over anything else during the design phase of the RB18? It is because he knew how important it was to keep an F1 car level when it's using a ground effect floor. So the next question has to be, why did he choose a different suspension setup to all the other cars on the grid? Because with the pull rod at the front and the push rod at the back, you can keep the car as level as possible. By using a pull rod system at the front, you can set up your wishbones in such a way that you minimize how much the nose dives under braking. When you hit the brakes in any car, the front of the nose tilts towards the floor. If you've ever had to hit the brakes hard in your car at home, you'll know what this feels like. Red Bull have mounted their front wishbone very high on the nose cone of the RB18 and RB19 to minimize this effect, and they can do this because they're using a pull rod system. The opposite is true at the back of the car as well. By using a push rod system, they can mount their rear wishbone really high on the car. This stops the back end of the car lifting up under braking. There are a few other teams on the grid using a push rod rear suspension, but Red Bull are the only team using that in combination with a pull rod front suspension. This combo of anti-lift at the back and anti-dive at the front means that the Red Bull car maintains its ground clearance better than any other car on the grid. Its downforce levels are then far more consistent, meaning that drivers are more confident in how the car will respond. Daniel Ricciardo recently spoke about how the AlphaTauri car is very predictable in the corners and under braking, compared to the McLaren cars that humbled him while at the team. He said it was that predictability that allowed him to push harder in an AlphaTauri than he ever could at McLaren. Speaking of McLaren, they're the only other team on the grid running a pull rod suspension system at the front of the car like Red Bull are. They also look like the only team capable of challenging Red Bull. We know that Mercedes are going to be rebuilding their chassis in the off-season after they ditch the zero-pod design in Monaco. If they have any sense, they'll also copy Red Bull's suspension philosophy when they do so. In this era of ground effect cars, a smooth ride is one of the biggest performance enablers, and Red Bull have found the recipe to that. Do you expect every car on the grid to turn up with a suspension system like Red Bull's next year? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and until next time, drive safe and bye for now.